Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a tour through the digestive system. I will try to make this short, but I do want to cover everything that I know is going to be on a basic overview of the licensing exam, as well as some specific questions I have heard some graduates asking as we go through this body system in study sessions. Now, what is the digestive system? What does it do? Its primary goal is to take food and nutrients, break it down into absorbable components that our body can use to metabolize into fuel or energy for the body, right? So it takes food in, it turns it into energy, and then it takes the waste products from that process and pushes it out through the body. So let's talk about these processes that make that happen. One of those is absorption. This is where nutrients and water gets broken down and moved into the blood vessels and lymph vessels. This happens in the small intestine. And there's also a ton of water reabsorption that happens and moves into the circulatory system in the large intestine. We have propulsion. Think of a propeller on a boat, moving it forward. All right, we're moving things along by swallowing. This happens in the oral cavity and the pharynx, the throat. All right, peristalsis, which is smooth muscular contraction to move things along in our body. This happens in the esophagus, stomach, small and large intestine. And there's also mechanical digestion. This is when we're mechanically breaking apart our food by chewing it in the mouth, crushing it between the teeth, churning it in the stomach, or segmenting it in the small intestine. And arguably, the most important one of these is going to be chemical digestion. Chemical digestion is where enzymes break down these large food molecules we have into smaller absorbable components like sugars, amino acids, and fatty acids. All right, this actually happens the minute food enters your mouth and it contacts saliva, which has enzymes in it like amylase. Then it continues in the stomach with hydrochloric acid and pepsin, and then concludes mostly in the small intestine with all kinds of pancreatic and intestinal enzymes, bile by way of the gallbladder from the liver. All of these molecules are then absorbed into the bloodstream to provide energy and building blocks for the body. So, what is the digestive system made out of? There's two major components. There's the alimentary canal, which is the main digestive system, and then there are accessory organs that secrete juices and enzymes to help us break down those foods, and they're a very important part of the digestive system, but they are accessories. They're not part of this main alimentary canal that we focus on a lot of the times when we talk about the digestive system. Well, what is the alimentary canal? I should call it the alimentary earthworm. All right. Like earthworms are one long tube from mouth to anus. So is your digestive system. It starts at the oral cavity at the mouth, then goes through the esophagus, which is a long muscular tube that dumps into the stomach, that then goes into the small intestine and squiggles around, and then it goes into the large intestine, and then it goes down and out through the rectum and the anus. You are one long, continuous, connected tube from your mouth to your anus. That is your alimentary canal or your alimentary earthworm. Now, food normally enters in through the mouth, through the oral cavity. This includes the cheeks, the tongue, the palate that frame the mouth. It's also called the buccal cavity, right? We think of cheeks when we talk about the buccal area, our buccinator or buccinator, depending on which teacher you have and how they pronounce it, tomato, tomato. That buccinator muscle is going to push that food inwards as you chew. I know very often on the licensing exam, you will be asked, what is the main muscular organ of mechanical digestion? That's going to be your tongue as it's swishing food around. Another super duper important thing in this area is the salivary glands. They are located in several places. There's the sublingual below the tongue, submandibular, which is clearly a little bit below the mandible that's in here. And these hold a lot of water, and a lot of enzymes. And they are constantly secreting to keep your mouth wet while breathing, while talking. It wants to keep up that mouth health that's in there. You usually secrete between 1 and 1.5 liters of saliva per day. Now, this secretion increases when you eat because that saliva is essential not only to start breaking down carbohydrates and stuff with amylase, but because it needs to moisten that food. You need that ball of food to be wet and sloppy to go into your throat, which is the next part of the digestive system, the pharynx or the throat. Now, remember when we talked about the respiratory system, the pharynx handles both food and air, so it does digestion and respiration. Now, when food enters the pharynx, involuntary muscle contractions close off those air passageways. We talked about the epiglottis slapping shut to protect the larynx. Now, we're only focused on the naso, oro, and hypopharynx, where things go in. Now, the nasopharynx is really only involved in breathing and speech, unless you're like me and start laughing and shoot potato salad up your nose. The nasopharynx is usually not involved whatsoever. But the oropharynx, oro for oral cavity, and the laryngo or the hypopharynx are used for both breathing and digestion. Now, the inferior border of that hypopharynx is what connects to the esophagus, and that is where food travels down to go into the digestive system. Now, the esophagus, super cool. It's a muscular tube that connects that pharynx to the stomach. The upper esophageal sphincter controls the movement of food from the pharynx into the esophagus. So it's about 25 centimeters or 10 inches in length, and it is located posterior to the trachea. Now, remember about the trachea, it stays open for that air passageway, right? It has those hard C-shaped cartilaginous rings that hold it open. The esophagus, however, collapses when it's not in use. It only engorges when there's actual food traveling down it. And it's a pretty straight shot from the pharynx or the throat down to the stomach through the mediastinum of the thorax. Now, to enter that abdomen, remember there's a super important muscle there that we use. It's the main muscle of breathing. That's the diaphragm. It basically cuts off the top half from the lower half of the torso. So for the esophagus to go through that, to go into the stomach, it has to go through an opening called the esophageal hiatus. Once it gets through there, the lower esophageal sphincter controls the movement of food from the esophagus into the stomach. Now, the stomach is what we usually think about being the main feature of the digestive system, although I would argue it's the small intestine. But here we are. This is where things get broken down quite a bit more, especially due to the acids that are in the stomach and the churning that is involved. So there are four main regions in the stomach. We have the cardia, we have the fundus, the body, and the pylorus. The cardia or the cardiac region is where the esophagus connects to the stomach, and that is where the food actually enters. This stomach sphincter here is called the cardiac sphincter. Then we have the dome-shaped fundus, which is the top of our stomach. Below the fundus is the main portion of the stomach, the largest part of the stomach called the body. All right. Anytime you have a large portion of an organ that's divided into several parts, the body is usually going to be the largest portion. Now, at the bottom of that, there is the pylorus that connects the stomach to the duodenum. We'll talk about the duodenum in just a second. This is where the pyloric sphincter is to keep acid and things of that nature and the food contained in the stomach without dropping straight into the small intestine. And it controls all of the stomach emptying. Another thing to mention here is the rugae. All right, the rugae that are in your stomach, these are the folds inside of your stomach that contain a lot of mucosa. That mucus lines your stomach and protects your own tissues, that epithelial and endothelial lining, from your acids. And it keeps all that food churning in there and allows for more surface area inside of the stomach. So as it goes out of the stomach through this pyloric sphincter opens up and allows things to go into the small intestine. The small intestine is actually the primary digestive organ in the body. So not only is this where most digestion occurs, but it's where almost all absorption of those nutrients into the body occurs. It's the longest part of the alimentary canal, and it has tons of folds inside the lining of it, just like we talked about the rugae inside of the stomach. In fact, there are so many folds that if you flatten them out, it would be more than 100 times the surface of your skin. So the small intestine is divided into 3 sections. From proximal, starting closest to the stomach or the heart, is the duodenum or duodenum, tomato, depending on who you're talking to for pronunciation. All right, that is this first section. And then it breaks into the second section, the jejunum. All right, that is a good portion of it. And then it goes into the ileum, which is the last portion of the small intestine. And that is right before it goes into the large intestine. Now, the large intestine is what we call the terminal part of the alimentary canal. Terminal meaning the end, right? It terminates at the large intestine. The primary function of the large intestine is to finish absorption of nutrients and water. It also synthesizes some vitamins, and more importantly, it forms the feces and eliminates them from the body. This is where we get the water back into our circulatory system and the waste out of the body. This is divided into 4 main regions, all right? The first one being the cecum. So there is an ileocecal valve located between the ileum of the small intestine and the cecum of the large intestine, and this controls the food traveling from the small intestine to the large intestine. Important to note here, we talk about the appendix more when we talk about the lymphatic system, but this little finger worm-like projection hanging off the bottom of the cecum right here that I am circling like crazy, that is your appendix. That little thing is what causes all those problems with appendicitis. It's dangling right there at the end of the cecum. Now, as the small intestine, the ileum connects to the cecum through the ileocecal valve, we then go into what's called the ascending colon. So the food enters right through here. Now we're going to go up the ascending colon. That's going to go up the right side of the body. And then we're going to go across the body, transverse. Remember, transverse is usually across. We're transversing the body with the colon. And then we go back down the descending colon. Now, as we go down the descending colon, it starts to swirl and curve a little bit, sort of a little S shape if it's laying on its side. This is called the sigmoid colon. And then it goes into the rectum, and then it goes into the anal canal and out the anus to the outside world through the anal sphincter to get those waste products out of the body. Now, an important thing to note here is I'm sure you've heard many times that you are going to massage your clients on the abdomen in a clockwise pattern. All right, we know that 12 o'clock is at top, 6 o'clock is at the bottom here, and we want to make sure that we are going the same direction as time. If you'll notice, if you follow that route from 6 o'clock to 12, we're going up the ascending colon, halfway over the transverse colon. Now, as we go from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock, we're finishing the transverse colon. 3 o'clock down to 6 o'clock. We're going down that descending colon back over to the area of the rectum. So you will be helping to move that fecal matter along the large intestine. You never want to move counterclockwise on the abdomen because you don't want to cause any potential backflow, especially if your client is one that struggles with things like gastroparesis or slowed peristalsis, especially if they're geriatric or if they're having any issues with constipation. Always go in a clockwise manner. All right. Now we're moving on to the accessory organs of digestion. All right. Here we have the three big boys of chemical digestion that really help us out. The first one is the liver. You're going to be asked about the liver, and it might be called the largest gland in the body because it is also an endocrine gland as well. It lies inferior to the diaphragm in the upper right quadrant of the abdominal cavity. All right. You're going to be asked about this. This is also why the right kidney lies lower than the left kidney because that big liver is pushing it down. All right. The liver is divided into two primary lobes. There's a very large right lobe and a much smaller left lobe, as the left lobe is sort of tucked up there just a little bit superior to the body of the stomach. Super cool fact with hepatic, remember anything that terms HEPA relates to the liver. With hepatic portal circulation, all blood from the alimentary canal actually passes through the liver. Bile is produced by the liver that performs emulsification of lipids. Those are your fats, all right? Lipase breaks down lipids, which are fats, in the small intestine with chemicals, again, like lipase. Now, the liver makes bile, but it doesn't store it. That's where the gallbladder comes into play. The gallbladder is a tiny little gland. It's an organ that's nestled in the shallow area on the posterior aspect of the right lobe of the liver. All right. It's very small underneath it, and it stores, concentrates, and propels the bile into the duodenum via the common bile duct. So it synthesizes bile if there's not enough. It activates when bile needs to be released into the small intestine. The liver makes it, sends it to the gallbladder. The gallbladder decides when to squirt it into the small intestine. We also have the pancreas. The pancreas lies transversely, all right? So it's laying horizontal or sideways, just like that transverse colon. It's almost parallel, but superior to that transverse colon. It is in the retroperitoneum, so it's behind the stomach. It has a mix of exocrine. Remember, that means it secretes digestive enzymes, and endocrine, releasing hormones into the blood functions. We talk about the pancreas in detail in the endocrine system, but it is super duper important to digestion, especially when we note some vital enzymes that it releases. Also important to mention is the islets of Langerhans. These cells produce the hormones like pancreatic polypeptide, insulin, glucagon, and somatostatin. The pancreas produces and delivers pancreatic juice, though, for the digestive system, which contains digestive enzymes and bicarbonate ions and delivers it directly into the duodenum as well through the pancreatic duct. So all of these accessory organs are secreting into that very first section of the small intestine. Why is this important? Why doesn't it happen before the stomach? Well, the stomach is full of acid that's incredibly, incredibly strong at breaking down our food particles, but potentially would react to these enzymes and not allow them to work to their full chemical potential. So let's talk about the passageway of food and what occurs with ingestion. All right. Ingestion is the taking in of food. When we chew our food with mechanical digestion and start to squirt saliva on it and moisten it in chemical digestion, it turns from our food particles into a wet ball called a bolus. All right. This bolus then travels through propulsion of chewing and then peristalsis in the esophagus down to the stomach where it is churned with a bunch of acids. This is where it becomes chyme, is what it is now called as it enters the small intestine. Then all of these pancreatic and digestive juices and bile is squirted into it as it's mixed and it goes through the small intestine. This is where all the absorption really occurs, where we take all of the minerals, vitamins, nutrients out of here. Then it travels, this chyme travels into the large intestine where water begins to be removed from it. There's still a little bit of vitamin manufacturing happening here, and it turns from this bolus to this chyme, and now it begins forming into what we call feces. And this fecal matter travels up the ascending colon, across the transverse colon, down the descending colon, through the sigmoid colon, into the rectum and anal canal, where it exits the anal sphincter in a process called defecation, which is removing those waste products from the body itself. I hope you found that helpful. That was our quick tour of the digestive system. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome to reach out. And if not, I will see you on the next one.